started. It is 9 o'clock. And the first thing I'll do is kind of explain a little bit about who I am, because I have been in the field of biology, wildlife research for 41 years. I'm retired now. I do a little consulting, so I'm still dabbling at it. But for the most part, I did a lot of wildlife research in Montana. I spent 31 years with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I studied grizzly bears and mountain lions and animal diseases and a variety of fur-bearing animals. I was raised in north central Montana, and so I'm third generation Montana. We've been around a while, and we had a business there for a long time in agriculture. After my stint, 31 years with the state of Montana, I retired. I was the chief of wildlife research for all of Montana, and so I had scientists doing all kinds of work. I won't elaborate a lot, but it was a lot of fun, and we did some pretty neat things. I had 16 scientists, and then I did some other things related to the harvest surveys and to the research lab, which I had previously supervised. But that career was kind of done in 2007, and I retired from them and went to an organization called the Wildlife Conservation Society, and most of you wouldn't even know who they are. But if you're old enough, you might, because they're the old New York Zoological Society. They're one of the very first conservation organizations in North America. Boone and Crockett Club and New York Zoological Society have strong ties to each other. I myself am a professional member of the Boone and Crockett Club, and they both started in the late 1800s, so they've been around quite a while. But you didn't hear a lot about WCS because they didn't run around suing people and making an image, a lot of stuff in the, not a news in the paper. They just quietly went around and did conservation science all over the world. And WCS actually owns the Bronx Zoo, Central Park Zoo, Queens, and Prospect, and they actually the New York Marine Aquarium. And they would send scientists out of those facilities into the world. And so we had scientists all over Africa, Asia, Russia, all over the place. I was assigned to North America, which made sense. And the crazy thing is the North America program base was here in Bozeman, so it made it work really good for me because I didn't have to move. But they're a great organization, still doing lots of work. I was hired for a couple jobs, but principally to be the coordinator of their bison program. And the trick here is, and you'll see a little bit about this, is that the Wildlife Conservation Societies were an organization called the American Bison Society emerged. Their first meetings, Teddy Roosevelt was the honorary president. There were a lot of notable conservation characters, George Bird Grinnell, even notable people of that time, Admiral Perry. They were all part of this American Bison Society, which formed in 1905. And when I was with the state, we went back to New York, and we were realizing I had been working with bison on some pretty tense issues related to Yellowstone. I spent a lot of time with Yellowstone bison and did my graduate work there way back in the 70s, which many of you can probably remember, but a lot of the young people have no clue what the 70s was. But it was through that experience of working with bison, they saw a value in my being involved in their bison program. And we launched a variety of things, but what we did do is, when I was with the state, I actually went back and begged them to restart the American Bison Society on its 100-year anniversary, so you can do the clock timing here. It's 2005. And they did. And then, of course, they hired me in the end, and I became the director of that American Bison Society initiative. Now, the trick is the American Bison Society, and you'll hear a little bit about them, every now and then, isn't a standalone NGO, and we did that on purpose because there's a lot of NGOs out there. Conservation NGOs, there's hundreds of them in the United States, and
So it didn't make sense to do that. We made it an initiative nested underneath the Wildlife Conservation Society program that I led. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, because it sort of kicked off a whole new movement, what we call the second recovery of bison. Their first recovery was 1905, and I'll get into that in the next talk next week. But the second recovery was kicked off, and a lot of science was being done then. We were funding a lot of research, looking at the science basis for moving forward with ecologically restoring bison. And believe it or not a lot had been done prior to that. And it's kind of strange with bison because, you know, they were one of the first species that inspired the conservation movement, because they were decimated, and I'll get into it a bit here. But besides that, at that time, Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, Hornaday, a whole bunch of notable conservation characters created this first movement of bison conservation because they thought they were going to lose them, and they came very, very close to that. And actually brought them back. So it was the first real species conservation ever done in the United States. And so, but at that time, they didn't have all this science that we have today that's behind us, that we can, you know, stand on the shoulders of these scientists that have done research. They didn't. They just kind of shot from the hip and did the things they thought they knew to do. Mostly they looked at an agricultural approach to conservation, because their agriculture was well ingrained, but wildlife science is pretty new. In fact, the science of ecology only began really truly in about the 1970s. So we're a pretty new science, and a lot of people don't realize that. If you think about particular time stamps, ecology and deep biology is pretty new, and it's even grown rapidly to be something much, much better and bigger than it used to be even in the 70s when I went to school. So anyway, there's a lot of history here, and so I'm going to try to weave that into this conversation a little bit, not only to explain the bison themselves, but the history behind it, because how bison relate to people and people relate to bison is very, very important. And it helped form an entire conservation movement that many of you are aware of. The ideas of saving elk and saving wolves and restoring, you know, grizzly bears to landscapes, and all that is kind of birthed out of these first initial efforts to save the American bison. So, without that, I'll get into it a little bit. And I want you to really understand that bison and humans, this is an ancient tale. And we, of course, in the Euro-American descendancy, think of it as more recent, but in fact, no, it goes back tens of thousands of years. And not only in the Native Americans in North America, but many of you may or may not know, and some of us, I know a lot of us, are Scandinavian descent. I'm deeply Scandinavian. Europe, there's a European bison, and if you go to European cave paintings, there's a lot of paintings of bison there. And so even our ancestors had a tie, an ancient tie to the European bison. The other thing to understand is some form of bison has existed on the North American continent for 200,000 years. And you can see on this little graphic that the mega bison, that's a giant bison with huge horns, and then the gradual progression through different species, and you can't read them, but there are different species that evolve to what we have today, which is the modern American bison. And the modern American bison is probably about 20,000 years old. And in fact, the human relationship to them is 13,000 years. So humans in this continent have had a strong relationship to bison for a very, very long time. And I'll delve into that a bit, including as far back as the Native Americans and the dog days before the horse. For a long, long time they hunted
bison, but they didn't have a horse to ride to chase them down. They had to do it on foot and through pounds and through buffalo jumps and all sorts of inventive ways to get bison. But the bison were at the heart of their spiritual world, and they saw bison as very, very important. So that strong tie, that strong ancient tie is really, really important even today. Because what you have today is all these different historical, cultural perspectives of this animal. And you'll see it in the debates that go on today even of what's going on with bison. You see it especially in Yellowstone with what's happening there. And of course there's clearly a Native American component, but even the pioneers that came out and the idea of manifest destiny and the Euro-Americans taking occupation in the West, and what you see, and this is a famous painting, you see the Native Americans with the buffalo running away and the Euro-Americans marching in, and that's somewhat a simplified form of the story of bison in North America. And we really did, we reduced bison down substantially. And so that this prehistoric to current time story is the one we are most familiar with, but I want to reinforce that there's actually this 10,000-year ancient story that's a lot more involved as well. But we all read and hear about this one, where you know the Euro-Americans came out, the Native Americans were slaughtering bison for food and shelter. The horse came into play. All these things came to interact, and that really is mostly, you know, from the 1700s, prehistoric times, to current times, and that's the story we're most familiar with. But as that progressed, as that time period progressed, we just about lost bison. We were very, very, very close, and by 1889. William Hornaday, who is the father of the Wildlife Conservation Society, counted 1,091 bison, and that little pink map kind of shows where some of them were in 1889. The light pink is where they are normally distributed. Now that's not even complete, because that's wrong, but it's what he did and what he knew at the time. There's a whole wood bison component, and I'll get into that in a bit, because there are two subspecies, but we debate whether they're actually subspecies. Wood bison in the north in the boreal forest, and plains bison down here in the Great Plains. But at any rate, you could see how it shrunk, and it shrunk even more because there was no protections at that point in time. In 1889, they were still slaughtering lots of bison, and the destruction was quite thorough, and you can see the pile of bones. That's a famous picture of the bones. And of course, after they destroyed all the bison, what they did is went out and got bones and had a whole fertilizer industry emerge about collecting bones. So even the bones of the bison disappeared from the Great Plains. And as I kind of mentioned, so there were people at that time, and we kind of call them the transcendental, in Boston, the Boston Transcendentalists began to think about the world differently. And you read books by Thoreau and you read Emerson, and they're starting to explain the world a little bit differently than just occupying it and taking from it. It's more of living with it and living in it. And some guys that were really well steeped and read in it is a guy like Teddy Roosevelt, who, by the way, was a Republican and a very political guy, but in fact, he had a heart for wildlife and really helped invent the modern conservation movement. But there were a whole lot of others, and there's some really neat books on that out right now. George Bird Grinnell is one of the other characters. Gifford Pinchot was the father of the Forest Service. You know, there were a bunch of them that they were tutelaged by these Boston Transcendentalists. The other thing is there were a lot of artists. George Catlin and John James Audubon, they were creating art of wildlife, and it sort of took hold. But Teddy Roosevelt was the guy who put things in action. He didn't just talk about it, he went and did things. And one of the things he did, along with some other guys, is William Hornaday in particular, started the American Bison site, which, as I mentioned earlier, chartered in 1905. And they started restoring bison. They started saying, hey, we got to do something to save the animal. And they did the best they could, but they got animals at the Bronx Zoo and some other places that were captive animals, brought them out to Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma to the Montana Bison Range. The National Bison Reserve was started by these characters. And Wind Cave National Park and on they went. And they literally created 9 of these places for bison to come back. We call that the Great Bison Recovery, or the first recovery of bison. And there's some really interesting human characters here. I can't possibly explain them all to you, but guys like Buffalo Jones, who was the best guy to catch buffalo, he would ride out in the range and rope them and bring in calves. He was the guy that could do that. He was known all over the U.S. for that. He brought animals in. He'd mother them up to cows. He was the first buffalo warden in Yellowstone Park. And that top picture's him skiing out in the wintertime with buffalo calves. He's bringing back the Yellowstone Park. And really what they did is they saved buffalo in like 5 captive herds, and then the 2 remaining free-ranging herds, which was Yellowstone National Park and Wood Buffalo National Park, way up in the Canadian boreal forest. And those were the 2 wild ones. But a very, very small number. And I estimate, nobody knows the exact low point on the population of bison, but it might have got as low as 300. I think it got very, very low. Now I will tell you a little side story. European bison got down to 9. And they've restored them now to 6,000. So there's a whole other recovery going on in Europe. What I will tell you that in their day, they took this more of an agricultural perspective. Let's just catch some, bring them into pens, and take care of them, and there they are. And it's great because they created a representation of the species, but there was no longer ecologically functional animals out there much, except in Yellowstone and wood buffalo. They didn't function in the system as a keystone herbivore, and that's a term that we use a lot to explain their role. And the whole idea of defining the ecological perspective came around much, much later, in fact, in more recent times. We had a couple of major workshops, and we sat down and brainstormed as a bunch of scientists to think about what is that? What is ecological? What is it that makes ecological restoration as compared to just holding bison in captive facilities? And what I always tell people is a lot of times what happened is they did a good job of bringing buffalo into captive facilities and allowing them to survive, but they didn't understand an ecological perspective. They didn't have that. What is the purpose of a bison? Why is it even on the grasslands? And we began to explore that more fully, and still are to this day. But some things we've learned with the modern science is that as a grazer, they were very, very specific in grazing in what we call a patch pattern. They would graze intensely in one area and then move on, then intensely in that area and then move on, and there was resting happening. And so this patch pattern of grazing was really, really important in creating diversity in these landscapes, diversity of plants, plant height, plant structure. And there was an entire suite of other species of wildlife that depended on that. So we call them bison bioengineers. They were engineering this prairie landscape for tens of thousands of years. They were shaping it, and they had a lot of impact, including cycling biomass. If you can imagine all the species out there now, many of you may or may not know Native Americans, when they were out living in the prairie, they wanted a fire. There was no wood around most of the places, so they were burning buffalo chips. Why? Because they were everywhere. They could find buffalo chips quite easily. And so we know that, in fact, this keystone herbivore probably determined the fate of what we call the temperate grasslands in North America. And what we do know today is that temperate grasslands are the least protected biome in the world. Less than 1% of it is protected. And so we have a lot of work to do to kind of make sure that stays intact. And part of it was because of
somewhat because of cattle grazing, but mostly because of homesteading and plowing. And much of the Great Plains is plowed up, especially the tall grass prairies in the Midwest. You can find very few places where there's tall grass prairie left. And as I mentioned, that we've elucidated all these interactions that are happening out there because of bison. Bison were keystone. They were central to it. And all these other interactions were dependent on bison being on that land and engineering the landscape. And so they were prey-based. They're large predators like wolves and bears. Their grazing is really important in terms of the relationship with prairie dogs. Prairie dogs, by the way, have been under threat a couple times, and the recovery effort for prairie dogs has been a real challenge because we don't have that same bison grazing relationship happening there. A lot of grassland birds, a lot of people don't know, when the mountain plover needs grassland areas that are barely any grass left, they're grazed heavily to live. That's where they live. Craig's pipit, on the other hand, likes the taller grass. So you need that patch grazing to create all this structure that's different for all these birds to survive. So the grassland birds are, lo and behold, the one group of birds that are in most decline and in serious trouble, and there's a lot of efforts. So some of them are listed. They're listed as endangered. And things you don't think about. They wallow, buffalo wallow. You see that buffalo on its side, and they create these sort of dusty pits. And in those pits, they fill temporarily with water. And you get amphibians living in these dusty pits and temporarily raising themselves there, and then off they go into other places. These wallows, some people look at them as they're all really bad, but in fact they were instrumental in structuring these plant and animal communities on the landscape. So these relationships are what are important in understanding how to restore a species. So one of the things we began to worry about was, well, are bison ecologically extinct? We may have a lot of bison, but are they ecologically extinct? And what you'll see is the blue line is the commercial bison herds raised for meat production. And that has taken off, and there's actually quite a few. There's hundreds of thousands, 200,000 to 300,000 that are in commercial herds. And that wax and wanes actually with the commercial value of bison, meat prices as they go up and down. The red line is actually what we did with the conservation herds, and what you see is we did really, really good until the 30s. And in the 30s, the American Bison Society said, oh, we got the job done, it's over. And we didn't do anything for a long, 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 long time. And so they stayed stagnant, didn't really grow. And conservation herds are like Yellowstone, Wind Cave, Wichita Mountains, all those refuges and parks and state herds that were managed for principally a conservation purpose. More recently, that black line is tribal interests. Tribal interests are rocketing right now, and that on tribal lands, there's a whole suite of bison being restored. But they didn't really form what they call the Intertribal Buffalo Council, which is now up to 80 tribes until 1992. So what you can see is a lot of this is fairly new. It's not, even the commercial stuff is fairly new. It's not something that's been around a lot. And we're sort of trying to figure out how to work with each other and to do this restoration so that we can bring back the ecological functionality of bison, not just having bison. And we had a huge workshop called the Vermejo Workshop. It was really it's in northern New Mexico, right on the Colorado-New Mexico border on the Vermejo Ranch. And we kind of began to describe what it is that we're looking at doing to ecologically restore bison. What is it that ecological restoration is? And so we kind of defined it and spent some time chasing down, well, where are we at? How are we doing? And IUCN is the International Union of Conservation Nature, and it has this Species Survival Committee. It's a global organization that looks at all the species in the world, and it is actually a sub-branch of the United Nations. I was the chair of the Bison Specialist Group for quite a while, and so what the IUCN does, it has this red list. The red list is like an endangered species status report. And it looks at species and says, where are we at, what are we doing? And the Bison Specialist Group formed just recently too. It wasn't that long ago. And in 2017, I wrote the last redness status report. I'll show you some of the results of that. But there's a new one coming out very soon. It's supposed to do it every 5 years, but you know, it's a volunteer organization, and people in volunteer organizations have jobs and real things to do, and sometimes things go slow. But I share that with you because what we've done is we've looked at bison and we've looked at this question of functionality. Are these bison functioning in an ecological system like they were intended, like God created them to do? And really, there's very few that are functioning as wild bison. There are only about 8 herds out of 64. And then we devised a category of some that are kind of in between. They're functioning as wild bison, but with some limitations. And the limitations might be range restriction or population restriction. Some herds, they only want 300, and so they keep it at 300. And that has its own effects to the population. Over half of or nearly half of the 64 conservation herds, they aren't functioning as wild bison at all. And they're more of a bison to be viewed and enjoyed to see, but they're not. There's no way to have a relationship with them or for them to have a relationship with lands again. So we really haven't fully told this story of ecological restoration along very far. We have a lot of work yet to do. And if we look at the numbers, I did mention to you that the wood bison, they're a little bit larger subspecies. So the truth is, many scientists say, they're a phantom subspecies. They really aren't real. That there were just what we call clinal variations. From some of you may not know, the Alaskan, Central Alaska, all the way to northern Mexico. There were bison in Mexico, the Chihuahua province, and other parts of Mexico. In fact, the first bison ever described, period, by a European was in Mexico City. So nonetheless, these numbers are not that big. 10,000 wood bison. Wood bison have been under a recovery plan. They're a listed species in Canada. There's a new restoration effort going on in Alaska, so now the United States has wood bison. It's a really neat project, and they're putting them in the middle of central Alaska in a real wild area. And as I mentioned, there were just these 8 that are functioning as wild. There's only 14,000 animals in that group. And then there's these different categories. So some of them are wild, but they're really small populations. And we know from genetics, small populations can't be sustained. And I'll show you a little bit on that in a bit. So at any rate, these numbers are not impressive. It's not like there's millions of buffalo today or hundreds of thousands of buffalo today in the conservation movement. We have a long ways to go. Commercial, they're doing great, but commercial highly varied from very, very small operations to some bigger ones like Ted Turner, which some of you are familiar with. But those bigger operations were relatively rare. The Durham Ranch, Ted Turner, a few others, 777, those places are pretty big. But most buffalo producers have about 50 animals on a small little ranch. And it's just because they love bison. The other thing is the acreage size that they can range in. And what you see is a big old cluster of bison herds, mostly in very small acreage. That's the other issue we're concerned about, is that if they're in a small space, are they able to ever function normally as a bison would? They're going to have to be managed in a quite different scheme than if they're left free and range wildly. So that's just to get the sense of space matters. And this is where they are. And some of you may or may not know it. This is the new range map we created with new data. And some of you may or may not know that George Washington killed buffalo in Virginia. There's a whole eastern buffalo story here that people don't know. Pennsylvania has quite a few bison. There's some great stories about that. Mariners would see them occasionally off the coast of Florida in the early days of sailors coming over here in the 1500s. Cabeza de Vaca in 1541 talked about buffalo down on the Texas Rio Grande area. In fact, he bumped into a group of people he called Humanos, and he called them the Buffalo people because they hunted buffalo. And you go down the Rio Grande, and you know it's desert country, but they were there. And then these northern portions of Mexico, and there's some new herds now started in Mexico as well. So they are sprinkled around. Again, they're highly variable. You can see the wood bison ones in there now. Now there's a couple plains bison ones that got put up in Alaska because people started moving different subspecies around. In the end, we're kind of going, probably don't matter. It's a done deal now. And the difference is genetically is not that great. So this big question is, what is the future of bison? Is one we've been wrestling with for some while. And we use all these fancy tools, and I won't get into it a lot, but population viability analysis with some vortex modeling, and I had convened this group of experts to do this as an IUCN exercise. And what we did is we looked at what's the risk of extinction. And fundamentally, we had the plains bison up there and then the wood bison down there. And we looked at how could they persist for 200 years. That's sort of our benchmark. And these numbers, don't worry about them, they're a little complicated, but fundamentally what they're saying is if you look at that F200 in Yellowstone, it's a very small number. The likelihood of it going extinct is very, 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 very low. That's what that's saying. But some others, not so well. The numbers are a little bit higher. And so what we do is these are the kind of the 8 big ones that we did. And this is more graphic that might explain it. This is the risk of the expected heterozygosity is just the diversity. You want to keep diversity in your genetics. And you'll see those two, the yellow and the blue line is Yellowstone and wood buffalo. And 200 years from now, they're probably still going to be pretty diverse and do pretty good. Almost all the others are a little bit of a downward trajectory, which has us a little concerned. Some of them are on a steeper downward trajectory, which has us greatly concerned. Which means that they could not maintain their genetic diversity as managed now. We would lose diversity. And this inbreeding level is kind of the opposite. It's kind of the opposite thing. You want to, if that inbreeding goes up, that's not a good thing. If the inbreeding stays kind of flat, you're okay. And so the bottom line is we pretty well know the genetic status of these animals and where they might be 200 years from now. So here again, the science is really elucidating to us what the situation is and what is important in restoring bison. And when we got down to the red list status, it came out as what we call near threatened, which is not a bad category, but we want to push it up. We want it to be not threatened. We still have a lot of progress to keep us from the vulnerable status. That's a bad one. And extinct is a really bad one. Those are the status categories under IUCN. And so what we're really concerned is a lot of the future of bison today rests in those 2 large herds, Yellowstone and wood buffalo. And these other herds, we've got some work to do. So there's a whole federal program going on now. We did this metapopulation analysis of looking at ways to move animals around herd to herd, to do the interchange scientifically and with intention. In the past, how they did it is, a bison manager, bison rangers call up somebody say, hey, I got 100 buffalo, I got to get rid of, you want them? And it was never an intentional design. And now we can do it with modern genetics intentionally. I will tell you that even now, the entire bison genome's been mapped. You've heard of the Human Genome Project. Scientists are all over mapping the entire genome of many, many, many animals right now. And that's kind of exploding our ability to think about the genetic question, because we have much more information. Scripture tells us, get understanding to get wisdom. And if we want to be wise managers of bison, we've got to get understanding. And so this is what this is really all about. I'll just go through this quickly because you guys want to get on, but there were a lot of things going on. There's a federal action. There's a Department of Interior Bison Conservation Initiative, which, by the way, was designed by Bernhard Secretary Bernard under the Trump administration, so they really kicked this off, which is a good thing. If I was to have written that BCI, I would have written it the way they did. So they did a good job. There's all sorts of things going on in the federal program, and more recently, some federal funding was approved to help, especially tribes, do more in terms of bison. So the federal side is pretty interesting, and these are all the Department of Interior herds. They're a central player in bison conservation in North America because they own many of the big herds. And so it is important that they be a player. And that was something recognized by Teddy Roosevelt and William Hornaday long ago, is that it needs a federal partner out there to set these reserves up and establish bison herds that can be sustained. I mentioned the Intertribal Buffalo Council in 1992, and they're really active. And now this says 60 members. They have 80 members now. And they have about 20,000 buffalo on 1 million acres of Indian land. So they're really taking off right now and doing some great things. And there's some interesting partnerships emerging. So for example, the Bronx Zoo, years ago I did what's called a quarantine study, and we got buffalo moved over to Fort Peck. You've been reading about that probably some. Fort Peck runs a little quarantine facility, and they get Yellowstone bison. It's important Yellowstone genetics. You saw why that was important in the previous part of this talk. And they're moving them out to other Indian herds, but I also got them to move 6 back to the Bronx Zoo. And I got them back in the Bronx Zoo, and they are starting to propagate those animals. The Bronx Zoo was historically the central place for gathering bison and sending them to Wichita Mountains, Wing Cape. So we reinvented that role. And it was a lot of fun. We had a really great pipe ceremony. The Lakota came out, and it was many stories to tell you about bringing the tribes to New York. So, but it was a fun adventure. And so the Bronx Zoo just recently released some of theirs to the Osage. And so the Osage herd is Yellowstone bison, important genetics, now in the hands of the Osage people. So this is part of the story, is building bridges with each other so that we can do these restoration initiatives. Here's some of the tribal ones of more recent origin, and you see the dates on there. It's pretty recent that much of this has happened. One of the other neat things we did is the Blackfeet Reservation. With my ties to Elk Island, we brought those animals back down from Elk Island to the Blackfeet Nation. Now, here's the trick with that. Those Elk Island bison actually originated in the Cock on the Blackfoot Reservation way, way back by Lakita, a tribal member, a Pend Oreille Indian, who brought them over to the Flathead and propagated them there and then sold them to Michael Pablo and James Allard. And they created what's called the Pablo Allard herd. Grew to 700 buffalo at one point. And in the end, Michael Pablo sold them to Canada because the U.S. wouldn't buy buffalo. They didn't want, at the time, they were still thinking that if a tribe's got buffalo, they would rise up and revolt. Well, so they did. Congress wouldn't approve money. Teddy Roosevelt felt really distraught about that. But some of those end up on the bison range. It's a tricky way they got there. But the bulk of them went to Canada. It's a great story of how they gathered them up and shipped them to Canada, and many of them were held at Elk Island, so that that's the only place in the world where we could get animals with genetics that came from its original homeland back to their homeland. And that was quite an adventure. Anyway, these things are going on. It's pretty fun. Alaska, Montana, Arizona, the Utah Book Cliffs with the Ute tribe and the Utah Game and Fish. And there's Canadian initiatives. There was recently a reintroduction into Banff National Park, which hit the news and was very, very well known, and I was able to be there for part of that. And Kosewik status review, I should mention, that's the Canadian version of the Endangered Species Act. They have a Kosewik that's a long, species extinction program that they look at. So anyway, these things are moving forward, and then there's these private initiatives, like the American Prairie Reserve in Montana. A lot of people don't know the Nature Conservancy owns many buffalo herds, and now Nature Conservancy Canada, which is the Canadian version of TNC. So they're private individuals that are doing that. And this is a map of where TNC is spending most of their time, and where you'll see they're at is in the tallgrass prairie. The last remnant places of the tallgrass prairie, there are these buffalo herds. And I had the great pleasure of going to the day when they brought the buffalo in and giving a talk there, just right outside Chicago. But these remnant tallgrass prairie areas that they've established and protected, are now, many of them have buffalo on them. I gotta go the right way here. And then private individuals are doing things, and they're very important for, like, even genetic warehousing. Ted Turner's Castle Rock herd is Yellowstone bison from back in the 30s. There was an extraction of bison out of the 30s that went to his place, and they've been there ever since, and kind of warehoused over there. But their genetics is real important, and we can keep those warehoused in there. And there are bison producers, conservation producers, and they have their own sets of guidelines of how to manage on their lands to protect grasslands and to enable bison to affect those grasslands while still making a profit on the commercial meat product side of it. So private initiatives are important. And then, as I mentioned, there's these crazy zoo tribe partnerships that are going on. And one of them that I brokered was the Oakland Zoo bringing, when we got the Elk Island bison out of Canada down to the Blackfeet gave Oakland Zoo 13 animals. They put them in the zoo at Oakland, and they are raising calves, and every year their calf crop comes back to the Blackfeet. And what it is it gives a voice to the for the Blackfeet Project. Oakland Zoo sees like 3 million visitors a year. A lot of people don't know Del Bronx Zoo sees 4 million visitors a year. So you're reaching out to a large audience to encourage them and support conservation of bison, and so you have a real educational potential there. And as I mentioned, the Bronx Zoo, we brought the Fort Peck bison that were really Yellowstone bison out to the Bronx Zoo and had a pipe ceremony there, and there they are. So what we're doing is we're building both a scientific and social basis for ecological restoration. And really what I'm going to do next Sunday is talk to you a little bit more about the social, cultural side of this, and elaborate that and kind of conclude with why would a Christian care about the protection of wildlife and bison. And we'll explore that more fully. But there's many facets to this, and I want to highlight one real quick here. Nature-based economics summit. One of the first things we did in working with the EME initiative I started in Blackfeet is an economic summit, and we sat down and said, what are your economic potentials here? And because economies matter, it matters. If you want to restore bison, we have to make it fit in a way that doesn't come at all costs. It has to have something that can benefit economically these, especially tribal societies. And it was a real experience. I'm not an economist, so I had a lot of learning to do, but we brought in people that could explain this. So I don't want this to be too rosy, because we still have major obstacles here to fight with yet. And part of it is that history. And everybody has their own time stamp. I come from an agricultural family. If you look at agriculture, it's time stamped. When you look at it, it's about 150 years. That's how long it's been around in the West. Not so much the East. If you look at the time stamp of the Native American people, it's tens of thousands of years. If you look at a time stamp of those of us that are ecologists, biologists, it's 50, 60 years. So when people look backwards and we need to get to this place, that's the wrong thing to do. You want to turn it around and look forward that we need to get to this new place. And those of us in our book club get this because we're studying T-Hard-B Chardin, and that's exactly what that is about. It's about how to get to this new creation, this new place in an evolving universe. There's a lot of things, you know, small population size, I showed you the genetics and the genetic integrity questions. Confusing legal status. Bison are thought to be wildlife in some places, livestock in other places, or both in some places, or extinct. They're listed as extinct in many states. So that's real confusing. And trying to create these partnerships. It's hard to create partnerships. People sometimes don't want to get along with each other. We're actually holding a summit. I'm starting in April. A couple of us have launched at the North American Bison Summit. The summit is about building bridges with agriculture, building partnerships, trying to extend our camp a little bit so that we're not excluding people from the discussion of bison conservation. So anyway, there are considerable obstacles, but I hang my hat a little bit on this. Aldo Leopold was the father of wildlife conservation. He's very famous, written many books. Most of us that did wildlife studied some of his books in first reading we ever did the Sand County Almanac. An excellent writer from Wisconsin. But he says this very thing: let us not have puny thoughts. Let us think on a greater scale. Let us not have those of the future decry our smallness of concept and lack of foresight. And that's what we're doing with this bison, taking the biology and the ecology and trying to understand where these animals fit into the modern world and how we can make it work better. So anyway, that's all I got. If you've got a question, if you let me know.